What were your impressions of him?
Well, Arlen had liked him, and you know, they seemed a lot alike, and they are a lot, you know. I mean, they're different in many ways, but they got along well. They liked each other, and Arlen and I had probably been a little closer together than I was with Glade. So, and all while he was on his mission, I wrote to him probably every week or very much that way. So I had met him through Arlen, you know, him telling me what a neat guy he was. I'd seen pictures, of course, and I thought he was cute. And so it was good. I remember saying things like, prior to this time, of course, you've seen 1 square foot of Idaho, you've seen the whole thing. I never want to live here. You got to be careful, and what you say you'll never do, because you will. We lived in Idaho because he was going to rent this farm. We had to be there close to his parents, use their farm equipment. There was a little house in the same ward, a mile away from his parents possibly, and we rented some furniture. We didn't have any furniture, but there was a couple, just up next door neighbors almost to where we were going to live, that were going on a mission, and they let us rent their furniture to live in a different house, and so that's where we lived all summer. But I think about October, maybe somewhere around there, the farming was done. Anyway, it was after farm was harvested and that, and the people who owned the house we were renting, they had a son who was coming home from the service or somewhere, and he needed that house to live in, so we had to find another place. George got a job in Idaho Falls working for Boise Cascade Lumber, and we found a house east of, in a little town called Ammon, east of Idaho Falls, and rented a house up there. We got married in Salt Lake. On our way home from the temple, to get a contrast of temple marriages now, there's a whole long time of pictures. We didn't do that. And we went home, and we'd found in the paper a stove that was offered for sale. We bought it on our way home from the wedding and went out to my parents' house. Mother had fixed that was my mother, fixed food, and we had our little wedding breakfast. I don't remember if anyone was there, except I don't think my dad. No, my dad might have been there. He should have been. Maybe he went to work. I can't remember. Arlen had to go back to school. He had been at the wedding too. Didn't have very many people. I had an aunt, and George's dad had a cousin or somebody that was there. There were very few people at the wedding. Anyway, I think just the family went back to my house and had a little wedding breakfast, and then that evening we had a reception at my uncle's home in Highland Park, probably around 27th South and I don't know what east of Highland Drive a little bit. Had a nice home there, and that's where we held our reception, partly because the church was in the process of being built. We were using it, we were meeting there, but it wasn't finished to where we could have a reception there. That's why we had it in there. And we had a next door neighbor whose husband, just a young couple. I don't say young, they'd both been on missions. They weren't children getting married, but nevertheless, he was a photographer, and he took our wedding pictures. That's the only wedding pictures I really have. I don't think I ever wondered about whether that was what I should have done. I just always knew. That was a strong enough impression for me to know that was right. We were happy. We were together. We bought a car just before we got married. I had some money because I'd been saving money while I was working. What else was I going to do with it? And so we bought a new car. We took a honeymoon. Well, the day after we were married, we had a reception in Louisville, Idaho, where he was from. There, they didn't send out invitations to everybody. They just announced in church, George Kershaw's getting married to this Norene Larson from Salt Lake, and they're having a wedding. I think even called them wedding dances. I don't remember what kind of music we had. phonograph probably. But we had, you know, people came, brought presents. I got to meet lots of people in the ward and so on. Not that I hadn't met some of them before, but family members and so on. Then we left on our honeymoon and went through Idaho, out through Boise, and followed the Snake River. So we went out through Portland and Astoria out to the point there and down the coast of California and into Nevada, and then we came back across Nevada into Salt Lake. So we were gone about a week. I didn't have a job, of course, down there. I'm not working in Salt Lake anymore. But I did get a job, and I hated it. And it was for the same kind of company. I just didn't like it. I worked a month or so on it. Enough.
What was the job?
I worked in a finance company, and I just didn't like it there. And so I quit. I just became a stay-at-home bride. Well, when we lived in Idaho, and I told you we lived in Ammon, Idaho, which was just 5 miles or less east of the main Idaho Falls. George got to, he wanted to get into a business with doing artificial insemination of cows. And there was a guy out in Nampa, Idaho, that wanted to take on a partner and help with it out there. So we went out, we moved to Nampa, which is between, it's about 10 miles from Boise. And so then we lived there till October. And the guy that he'd been working for wanted to pay him less, and it was really hard to live on what we were making as it was. And he wasn't quite satisfied with the situation. We decided to move back to Salt Lake. So we moved in October to Salt Lake, lived with my parents for about a month, and then we bought, with Dad's help, we managed to make a down payment on a little house on the west side of Salt Lake. And we lived there for about 3 years. Cheryl was also born while we lived there, and it was just before George got a job he had taken training in computers. Well, they weren't really computers, whatever they were at that point. They were in their very infancy. He worked for a Hogle investment company in Salt Lake. And then he got a job in Brigham City, where my parents had moved when Thiokol was an infant organization, and we moved to Brigham City. And so we took the money from our house and held on to it while we lived in Rose Park for about 3 months, and then we moved to Brigham City when he got a job up there, and lived there for 13 years. So in the meantime, we had Connie, which was born right after we moved up there, like 6 weeks later, and then 5 years later almost, we had David up there. David was 8 years old by the time we moved to Kaysville, and Chrissy had just graduated from high school, so our kids are from 8 to 18, scattered along there. It was wonderful to have a baby, especially a little girl. I'd always wanted a sister. Now I got a little girl, and it was wonderful, and it was weird to be pregnant again in a few months' time, you know. And but you know, I didn't know. I worried that I wouldn't have enough love for this little boy, because I just gave all my love to Christy. She was just the center of my world. But I found out that you don't divide love; it multiplies, and it kept multiplying because we kept having children. But and the first 6 months of David's life were hard, because I had 2 babies basically. Christy had just learning to walk when when Lynn was born, and you spend a lot of time holding a baby and feeding him and changing him and bathing him and all the things you do. And I had 2 almost in the same situation. They both need all this care. But once Lynn was 6 months old, he could sit on the floor and I'd give them a box of toys, and Christy would play. And they didn't interact really. They were too young to really interact, but they had companionship. They saw another baby there with them, and they played together, and they just grew up together. But it was a hard change for Christy when I brought that baby home from the hospital. This wasn't right. This just wasn't right. And I remember Mother had come up to stay with me for a week when I got home from the hospital. And one day I felt well enough to go out, and we needed go buy some groceries. And I took Christy with me, and the baby, Lynn, was home with Mother. And it was like, Christy was like, oh, this is the way it ought to be. This is my life. I don't know what to do with that other kid. But they got used to each other, obviously. There was cloth diaper days and plastic pants over that so that it didn't run all over you when they went.
Do you think you were a good mom?
I think I was, because I was full-time with them. And when we were living, when Lynn was born and that time out there in Nampa area, George went in the mornings and at short time in the morning and the evenings working with cows, and I was home with the kids. But he was there when they woke up. He would bathe Christy and I would bathe Lynn, because timing was pretty close there. And then I was home alone with them again in the evening, but basically he was home with me quite a bit. That had to be a lot of help. So Lynn was about 6 months old when we moved from there and back to Salt Lake. So they were to that point where they could play together. He could sit up, she could play with him. And she did, and the potty training, she was the earliest one. Truthfully, she was about potty trained when Lynn was born. But then that new baby, there's this problem here. And she kind of went back to her old ways, but only for a short time. And then she was potty trained. So I really only had one in diapers most of Lynn's life. Christy was trained. I guess I was brought up with a loving mother, and that I had a good pattern. And I just loved those kids. And I got a lot of support out of my husband at that point too, because I had to. It would have been a much harder job if he had gone to work all day in the daytime. I think the fact that he was there to get us started in the morning and through the day, and then he went again. But we got started, and when he came home from his morning chores, and then it was gone again, he was there through the middle of the day, helped with taking care of the kids. So that part of it was easy. But I think when you love your children, they know they're loved, and it just makes motherhood possible. That's all. But we were a family. I wasn't alone trying to do this by myself. Later, it was more like that when he was in the bishopric for over 4 years, and that was during the time that David was born. That was harder. You try sitting alone in church with 5 kids. You've got some idea what that's like.